really, again, happy to welcome Luke from Ookla. Luke is an analyst for the telecommunication from the company, who has long experience in the telecommunication and also bringing insights from the telecommunication data. And today, his presentation is focused on Europe, on the state of telecommunication in Europe, and plus more, I see the data-driven perspective in telecommunication as a larger scope of the presentation. But without taking much in the introduction, welcome again, Luke, and the floor is yours. We are all ears today, and looking forward also to having interactive sessions. During the presentation, please feel free to ask questions in the chat. And also during the presentation, we'll have some stops, Luke, right, to take questions in an interactive manner. And hopefully also we'll have some time by the end of the presentation for Q&A. Okay, the floor is yours. Welcome again.
Super. Thank you very much, Anas, and thank you, Anand, as well, for inviting me and setting this up. And delighted to be here. And it's, I think, a great time point in the year to reflect on what has gone on over the last year and where Europe is, and I suppose the broader market really on the telecom side at the moment. And today, I suppose I just want to bring together a compendium of insights from our research over the last year, and some new things as well that we have not put into the public forum before. So I think there should be some very interesting insights here, data-based insights that we'll get through. So as Anas mentioned, I will go through this in a section by section approach. I'll speak a little bit about that in terms of going mobile, fixed, direct to device, and other areas. And then it'll be an opportunity throughout the presentation to actually have interactive comments and feedback. I know a recording will be made available as well to those that have signed up and will receive it afterwards. So thank you again, Anas, for having me here. So my name is Luke Kehoe. I lead research in Europe with Ookla. Probably, I'm sure many people joining the session will have heard of Ookla before, most particularly for the Speedtest brand, which is by far and away the world's largest consumer-initiated speed test sample base. So it's a crowdsourced sample that gives a detailed picture of how performance is evolving over time. I'm just going to go through a very quick overview of where we come from to provide context for the data in this presentation. Kehoe is our Wi-Fi design and optimization business. Down Detector, which I'm sure many will have seen quite prolifically in the news in the last few weeks on the back of big outages with AWS, and yesterday or the day before, Cloudflare, which actually impacted us as well. Down Detector is a tsunami warning system for outages, so it gives us an insight into how the service layer is performing over time. And then RootMetrics is our controlled test business, gives us a deeper insight into the layer 2 of the network in those markets where we're performing drive walk tests. And just some information here about the data points that we have, very significant user base, obviously, across Down Detector and Speedtest, and we work collaboratively with regulators all across the world. Large bodies like the OECD, European Commission, and others to provide data. And also to benchmark competitiveness of countries and of operators, and to quantify the impact of policy measures. So I suppose my role within Ookla really is to increase the visibility of our data in the public domain and develop our research strategy, and to ensure that Ookla is a thought leader in the many different domains that I'll speak about here around things like 5G SA and direct to device. So that's just a very quick overview of Ookla and the background context. This is the plan of action for the session this morning. So I'm going to start off with a quick look at the mobile side, 5G and legacy sunsets, and then move into other topics, the likes of LEO, fixed, resilience, as you can see there, and some novel research that we haven't shared publicly before around the impact of cell density, for example, on device battery life, which is some really interesting emerging research that we are working on there with different MNOs and other players in the space. And as well as that, then looking more forward in nature at the potential impact of AI on traffic demand and the traffic growth profile. So first things first, I wanted to start off by actually looking at and actually asking, where are we in a European context in terms of 5G rollout and 5G usage. And what you're seeing here, and it's the first time we've shared this publicly, is a map that displays where 5G is most commonly used throughout Europe. And this is looking at the entire device pool in circulation. So both 5G capable and non-5G capable. And the reason we are choosing the full device pool to expose here is to give an insight into those markets whereby maybe legacy devices in the actual device mix may be actually artificially bringing down usage of 5G still in some countries. And I think I'd like to draw your attention in the first instance to the UK here. We all know from a regulatory perspective, policy perspective, the UK, has quite a high level of 5G coverage, certainly a higher level than some Eastern European countries, notwithstanding challenges. But if we look at the actual usage and where 5G is most commonly used, it's actually not as widespread as you would expect in the context of the UK, and indeed in some other places like Spain and others. And what we're doing here, just as a methodology note, is that on a tile-by-tile basis, we are looking at, in that tile, are more than 50% of the samples using 5G? And if so, it's categorized as a 5G tile. And what you're seeing here in the context of the UK and other markets is that there may be a reasonable level of 5G coverage in principle, but the devices may not be configured for 5G, for example, or there may be tariff level restrictions on 5G access. And that is something that I suppose has not been so much of a problem quite now in the 5G cycle, but we're starting to see that become a problem as SA is commercialized. In that many operators have gone down the route of limiting SA access to premium tariffs, or there is a lack of carrier files provisioned on the device level, which has really artificially brought down actual real-world usage of SA in practice. And I just wanted to show this this is looking at all of SA and NSA in this map. I just wanted to show this to really color any discussion around actual 5G usage and 5G deployment, because, at a policy level, there's so much talk around population coverage, and maybe somewhat of a detachment from what the reality is on the ground. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that more in a few moments in the context of indoor cellular coverage. That's another area where has been a blind spot from a policy perspective in recent years, in that all the focus has been on the outdoor, but how can we actually go about quantifying the indoor? And there is quite exciting momentum in some markets globally around bringing in policy instruments to actually improve indoor specific outcomes from a cellular perspective. So that's just looking at that. So what does the data say about European 5G in general? Well, in terms of coverage, this is our metric for 5G availability, which measures the proportion of samples that spend the majority of their time connected to 5G. You can see here that the ones you would expect, the likes of Denmark, Switzerland and Sweden, are performing very, very well in 5G availability. And those countries, in particular, the likes of Sweden, have really moving ahead thanks to extensive low-band deployment. So very aggressive 700 megahertz use. And some other countries have been later in assigning that spectrum. There are countries as well here whose level of 5G coverage is perhaps artificially inflated by use of dynamic spectrum sharing, or DSS, which is great for filling in the map and the indicator on the device level, but doesn't necessarily translate into a step change in user experience. And that is something to be mindful here. Ireland is one that stands out, actually quite a significant level of DSS use in the Irish 5G mix among 2 of the 3 operators. And that artificially brings up the coverage beyond what the performance would suggest if we look at things like speeds, for example. This is from the second quarter of this year. It's useful to look at, I think, coverage metrics on a standalone basis, but I think it's a lot more useful if you actually combine them with the actual background market context and try and understand what are the factors at play that may be actually stimulating the levels of coverage that we see in the real world. And intuition, I suppose, would suggest that a more dense population would lead to better outcomes from a coverage perspective. But in actual fact, we don't see that in the context of our data. And this is true for Europe and other regions globally. You can see here on this particular scatter plot that some of those countries that have lower population density, and as well if we were to look at urbanization rate, similar can be true, that there's higher levels of 5G availability here. So what I'm saying here basically is that countries are not chained or inherently limited by some of the structural challenges they face, that there are other tools that can be used to overcome these. And indeed, many of the countries, particularly in the Nordics and elsewhere, have used other tools to overcome some of the, what would be expected to be inherent disadvantages. And one of those, quite clearly and probably unsurprisingly, is progressive spectrum assignment, and assigning spectrum early and prudently. And you can see here quite a strong link between the days since auction of 5G spectrum assignment and the levels of coverage that have been achieved. Again, this is not something that should be surprising, but it's interesting to see it actually, in the data. So, some of the countries like Finland, for example, which was a very early mover, having very good level of 5G availability. This is one of the inputs into that. There are others, Belgium, for example, was very late for a multitude of different reasons on 5G spectrum assignment, and that has had a significant negative impact on outcomes there. And the same is true for places like Poland as well. There are some interesting examples that might be outliers, like the Netherlands. They were very late on their 3.5 gigahertz release, but the operators there moved with a lot of DSS in advance of that. And those are kind of some things to be mindful of when looking at data like this. But the overriding message is that, policy plays a huge role above and beyond demographics and, topographical challenges, and that, intervening from a policy perspective with supports, whether it's progressive spectrum assignment, or in some cases, actually, coverage obligations, which the Nordic countries have been very proactive in using, or changing the auction design. We have seen in some countries now, like New Zealand, the emergence of reverse auction processes, whereby the operators actually get some money back if they meet particular coverage goals, which really inverts the entire, process of an auction. And creates incentives and a carrot approach rather than the stick approach maybe that would have been traditionally used. And there's some early success in respect of that in those countries and in places like New Zealand. In terms of 5G SA, the picture is very different. There are a huge number of markets that have still not moved on commercialization, and some markets where only one operator is proactive in deployment. But Spain really is a real leader in SA actual deployment and usage. So what we're looking at here is the proportion of Speedtest samples out of all those that were 5G, the proportion that were SA based or SA originated. And you can see here in the second quarter, quite a significant lead for Spain. Now the Spanish have been, I would say, probably the most aggressive in Europe in using subsidy mechanisms to stimulate higher levels of coverage. So they have drawn down a lot of money from the EU Commission's Pandemic Recovery Fund for SA deployment, particularly in those rural areas where there actually are mandates on sites being SA capable. So you have a scenario whereby multiple Spanish operators now have very large SA footprints and quite significant spectrum diversity on those SA footprints, which is a really important point, which I'll come to. The UK really is an interesting one here as well, in that it's quite a laggard across most 5G metrics and mobile metrics in general, but in terms of SA, has been doing quite well. And we're actually starting to see a kind of, stimulation of additional competition in the market now, in respect of some of the changes there from the merger and some of the commitments that came out of the merger process around reaching a certain level of 5G coverage by a certain point. So there are some kind of green shoots starting to emerge in the UK market in respect of that. We always get the question, can you see any tangible difference in the performance outcomes on the 5G SA network? And the answer absolutely is yes. This is a sample from Greece, where one of the operators there, Cosmotel, has been quite active with a significant SA rollout. And based on the Speedtest data here, we can see that at the 10th percentile level, so the bottom 10% of samples, which is always more instructive in my view, rather than looking at the top 90%, actually looking at, you know, the worst served users, what is their experience. And you can see here a significant uplift from NSA to SA. Now, this is not always the case. I should preface that where SA is observed, it doesn't always mean the performance is better. In fact, it can be worse, and we've seen it worse in some markets where the operator has not moved enough spectrum onto the SA network, because the NSA obviously benefits from having the LTE anchor, and where you move to SA and don't make you know, enough spectrum available on the SA network to I suppose go up against what would have been there on the NSA with the LTE anchor, you can have a disimprovement. But Greece is an example of whereby the operator there has gone with a lot of spectrum diversity, and the UK as well. The operators there, the likes of BT in particular, have very significant spectrum diversity on their SA network, which has enabled a step change in performance outcomes. Of course, latency is the key benefit that's often touted with the 5G core with SA, and we do see that. This is again looking at the worst 10% of samples in Greece, and we see, you know, about a 30% improvement in latency at the worst 10% level, which again is quite a tangible one, and one that will cut through in use cases that require lower latency. So this very one here, the video conferencing, for example. What are we seeing actually globally in terms of how our operators trying to monetize SA? This is looking at it from a consumer lens and a consumer view. I will be frank, and I personally believe that in Europe, the SA commercialization, or sorry, SA monetization momentum has been very weak. And I think many operators have actually resigned to the fact that they're probably not going to be able to monetize it on the consumer side. So much of the focus has moved to the enterprise side, looking at things like first responder networks, for example, with slices, which T-Mobile in the US has been proactive on, ICE has been proactive on in Norway. You know, those kind of enterprise use cases are gaining a little bit more monetization momentum than the consumer side. But notwithstanding that, many Asian operators have been very proactive, the likes of Singtel in Singapore, China Mobile and others, on differentiated tariffs, you know, providing guaranteed uplink, for example, in a stadium venue, geofenced, to provide a better experience, for example, for when you want to send a video when you're at a concert. So there are early examples of kind of innovation on the tariff side and segmenting the customer base and trying to stimulate better outcomes. But to be honest, my view is that the consumer monetization potential of slicing is probably limited in Europe, being frank. The examples of FWA are very interesting, particularly with 3 in Austria, and I believe Elisa in Finland. They have developed SA-based FWA slices and a slice solution whereby they guarantee a minimum level of performance on the FWA product, even at peak times. So making it similar to a fixed connection with fiber, and trying to target that fear factor with FWA around speeds going down at peak time. So there is some innovation taking place there around using, you know, slices for FWA, but it's quite nascent. And of course, Geo in India has been by far and away the biggest success story in the context of FWA. I would say even more so than the US operators with their Geo Air Fiber product, and that's obviously built on an SA network as well. And just before I move on, to zoom out, and people ask, you know, where is Europe at in a one-liner in terms of SA? Well, our latest data shows globally, in the US, around 20% of Speedtest samples are based on SA. In India, it's over 50%. In China, it's over 80%. And in Europe, it's around 1%, still around 1% this year. So, I mean, the gulf there is absolutely enormous in terms of the actual coverage and then the actual usage of the SA networks between the different regions. And it should be mentioned that the European Commission has no actual coverage target or deployment target for SA in the digital decade goals. It solely focuses on 5G, you know, 100% 5G outdoor population coverage. And I think, you know, there are discussions ongoing, I suppose, as part of the DNA, the Digital Networks Act, to understand and really to improve the specificity of those targets, to look at things like, okay, what spectrum is being used, because there's a very different 5G experience, as we know, between DSS and mid-band, and what technology is it, NSA or SA, for example, and looking at indoor as well in a more muscular format. Looking at speeds and median mobile download speeds, this is for the second quarter of this year. What you're seeing here is that many countries in Eastern Europe actually do quite well, and certainly better than they did on coverage, which is quite interesting, and that many Western European countries here are not doing so good, or certainly not in the upper echelons of the rankings. I've highlighted Greece here again based on the previous example I gave from the SA performance comparison. You can see Sweden as well here, one that did very well on coverage, but maybe is not in the top of the ranking on speed. And again, that is you know, a byproduct of being very aggressive in low band deployment, and maybe not as much so on the mid-band side relative to some other countries like Bulgaria, with the Bulgarians really have gone all in on mid-band, massive MIMO. I know I was actually there quite recently in our speed test data. Actually, A1, one of the operators there, is the fastest in Europe, and they have a very pervasive Nokia deployment of 64T, 64R radios nationally. So there's interesting work in the different markets there, but massive MIMO has really propelled, and mid-band has propelled Bulgaria, and there are strong performers you know, beyond A1 in that market as well. And places like Denmark as well, then obviously that is potentially an example whereby the demographics are conducive to, you know, high levels of coverage, and obviously also been very progressive in terms of spectrum auctions, where they've had coverage obligations on operators. There's network sharing as well, and that's one thing that a lot of the Nordic countries have been proactive on, the use of network sharing, and that has stimulated better levels of coverage, we see. One question then, you know, moving away from 5G, still staying on the mobile side, is where are we actually in terms of the legacy network sunset? And this is data, again, that we haven't shared in the public domain yet, and I'm sharing it here now. This is looking at where 3G or 2G are most commonly used. So going on a tile-by-tile basis, if over 50% of samples there were 3G based, we would categorize it as a 3G tile. And it might be difficult to see on your screen, but I just highlight here, looking at the 3G side, places like Belarus and Moldova, you can see there is still significant usage of legacy RAT technologies there. You know, the consumers there are actually spending most of their time on 3G, which is quite startling when you look at that from a European perspective. In terms of 2G, obviously the damage to infrastructure in Ukraine has unfortunately had a negative impact, and we can see that in our data. There is still significant fallback to 2G in Ukraine, and in some other European countries, Bosnia on the 3G side as well, and a few others. But if you look at places like Germany and Poland and others, there's, you know, particularly with Germany, there's been proactive work on the network sunsets there. I know in Sweden, there's been a lot of work ongoing towards the end of this year, as most of the legacy networks are wrapped up, and I believe maybe it could be Telia that might last a little bit longer with their legacy network. But the big picture really is that you know, the 3G sunset and the 2G sunset is moving ahead quite quickly, and now in many European markets. But there are challenges, and you know, there is no better example of that than what happened, I suppose, recently in Australia, where they moved very aggressively on the legacy technology sunset, and that has posed huge challenges then around emergency calling access on devices that were blocked, for example. And we have also seen a trend whereby those countries that prematurely sunset 2G or 3G end up pushing more users into locations with no service deep indoors. So where 2G or 3G would have been the fallback layer, and it is then removed, the device may move into a no service zone if 4G and 5G is not proactively refarmed. And we've seen that in the context of the UK. This is from the London skyline here and the London building grid. And what you're looking at here is the indoor cellular coverage outcomes in the real world data we have. This is not prediction based. This is based on the real world samples from Android devices. And you can see significant clusters of buildings in red that have, you know, multiple operators with poor to no coverage. So what does that mean practically? It means you're inside and maybe you can't call or you can't text, let alone use data. A public safety risk, clearly. And this is something that has disimproved over time in many cities, particularly in London. Particularly on one operator that moved early on the 3G sunset, we saw a double-digit percentage increase in the time that their users were spending in areas with no service as a result of the 3G sunset there with Vodafone. This is just a cautionary note around sunsets and as well around more broadly indoor cellular coverage. Of course, there are other factors here that impact cellular, indoor cellular recently, you know, building retrofits being a primary one, the use of low E-glass windows, transforming buildings effectively into Faraday cages for signal penetration. As well, UK specific, there was changes as well to the rental fees that could be extracted by landlords for putting cellular equipment on rooftops and on other land. The operators lobbied for a reduction in those fees, thinking it would be a good outcome, and actually it came back to bite them in that the provision of rooftops reduced because rooftop owners said, we're not getting enough rental revenue for our site, so we'll put a rooftop bar here instead, or we'll put a rooftop garden. And it's a cautionary note again around policy measures that maybe look good on paper, but in the long run can actually make things worse. And the UK is a very good example, a cautionary note about that. On the in-building side, we are seeing progress now internationally. So, you know, globally, many regulators are starting to look at it from a more robust perspective. I know we've been in discussions ourselves with Ofcom around actually quantifying indoor cellular coverage on, you know, square foot basis, for example. How could we develop a metric to look at how much floor space is covered by good cellular signal, not just looking at outdoor? And the Asian countries here that I've noted, the likes of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Korea being similar, have been very progressive, and Saudi Arabia more recently, around implementing provisions at the build stage for new developments that ensure there is access for mobile operators in the same way in many markets there already is for fixed networks and fiber. So that, you know, for new large scale developments, there are opportunities there for operators to deploy neutral host solutions, for example, or neutral hosts to intervene. Elsewhere in the Nordics, actually, Norway has recently published advice to building owners there, providing information on the need for cellular coverage, how to work with operators. So we are starting to see the cogs starting to turn. Regulators, you know, paying more attention to indoor cellular. They were blind previously. They're now getting data. They're now starting to see it. They're starting to legislate for it. So there's a lot of momentum here, which is good to see. And indeed, in places like the US, public funding has been provided actually to improve indoor cellular. So in some states, for example, there are E911 programs whereby funding is being provided to provide deep university campus coverage, because it is seen as a public safety risk not to have access to calling and texting deep indoors. And this is, you know, a really important policy theme that I think is going to continue to expand moving into next year. And we are seeing momentum across regulators globally on the indoor cellular side. And, you know, the business model is advancing as well in the context of neutral host in particular. Moving very quickly then to a completely different topic, but I would argue maybe an even more interesting one, on low Earth orbit and how it is actually performing in the real world in Europe. You know, there's been so much talk around Starlink and I suppose now Amazon Leo or Kuiper acting as an alternative to fixed broadband, but is it actually competitive? And, you know, as more and more people turn to it, we've seen a significant increase in usage of Starlink in our data, particular spikes as well after storm events, you know, places like Ireland, the UK last winter, in the context of Spain and Portugal after the blackout. Many businesses procuring satellite solutions as redundancy or backup. Not to say that those satellite solutions themselves are immune from outages, but they are part of a redundancy toolkit. And we saw in the Spanish outage, for example, that Starlink continued to work and that traffic was rerouted to other ground stations and traffic breakouts, which is an example of that multi-country resiliency. This is an example from Greece. I use Greece because Greece is a fiber poor market. so not so much fiber in the fixed base. But what you can see here is that over time, the competitiveness of Starlink on the latency side has really improved. In around the third quarter of last year, you had a collapse in Starlink latency, you know, from a median of just over 100 milliseconds to, you know, in the 40 millisecond range, which is significant improvement, really tangible from an end user use case perspective. Now, it is still significantly poorer than your average Greek fixed connection, you know, 50% higher latency at the median level. And, you know, you can see that the improvement has started to flatline a little bit for the moment. But this improvement has been principally driven by breaking the traffic out closer to the user. So the Starlink network architecture has improved, I suppose, from a peering and interconnect standpoint and traffic breakout, but also as well improving the satellite constellation density and the ground station density. And this is, I think, the most striking example here. This is looking at median download speeds. Bear in mind, this is a market where we've seen very significant uptake of Starlink, so a lot of load on the network. And the average Starlink connection is providing, in the most recent quarter, a median connection speed 60% higher than the average Greek fixed connection. And you can see the Starlink performance profile has been quite cyclical in nature. It's gone through cycles of increasing and decreasing as the network is replenished with more satellites when demand starts to exceed supply, and vice versa. So we're in a period now at the moment where speeds are starting to trend down again, and maybe some work might need to be done to improve outcomes again as more people come on board. Now, this is not to say, obviously, that LEO is, you know, more competitive overall than fiber. This is looking at the entire Greek fixed base where there's a lot of copper. Clearly, if you were to go fiber to LEO, there's a, you know, substantial physics-based technology difference there. But the point is that, you know, LEO and solutions like it really are actually, you know, quite competitive in the marketplace and are becoming more competitive over time, and are part of the toolkit in those locations maybe that don't have fixed connections, and maybe in others are challenging FWA as well, in terms of the both the price point in some markets and then as well the performance as well, depending on the market context. We have done a lot of research quite recently on looking at where the direct-to-device is starting to be used internationally. And the US, of course, being one of the first markets where direct-to-device is commercially available, and T-Mobile with T-Satellite launching a direct-to-device solution and enabling access to a number of basic apps in locations with no cellular coverage, the likes of WhatsApp, for example, and the Trails app and Google Maps and whatever. What you're seeing here is in speed test samples where we have seen Starlink direct-to-device being used in the US so far this year. And unsurprisingly, the usage is clustering in areas of national forests and national parks. I'll just go in a more zoomed in view here, national forests and national parks. Yes, it's a very small proportion of user time that they're left with no service, but in these locations, it is actually being used and it is providing good outcomes. And we can see that in our data, and it is scaling. And the interesting, I suppose, point about the usage of Starlink in the US has been that T-Mobile have used it as a kind of a competitive, I suppose, advantage in the market, or part of competitive messaging, in that they've allowed AT&T and Verizon subscribers to use the T-Mobile or T-Satellite service as well. So they've used it as a tool to stimulate churn in the marketplace, and then obviously in the longer term to hopefully stimulate higher ARPU as an added or add-on or bundle add-on. I will say that I am more, you know, circumspect about the D2D opportunity in Europe. I think there's a lot of hype. Europe is very different than a large landmass country like the US or like Australia or like Saudi Arabia, particularly countries in Western Europe, which we saw already have quite good levels of cellular coverage. The proportion of user time spent in locations like this that would have no signal would be quite small in Europe. And actually, you know, many would argue that the indoor cellular side is a more pressing one than direct-to-device potentially in Europe. But notwithstanding that, you know, there is momentum. The UK has been a leader again here with Ofcom. starting to look at in the early part of next year, enabling the commercialization of direct-to-device services. We saw recently O2 in the UK announce an exclusive partnership with Starlink to be one of the first to launch in the UK. Vodafone, obviously, as a group, is tied in with AST Space Mobile, and they'll be coming at a later point. So there's momentum in Europe as well. I know Kiev, Star in Ukraine have done work as well with Starlink and SpaceX on this. But I suppose the point around direct-to-device is that we're expecting a lot of momentum next year. In our data, we can see it being used already in the US. It is performing an important function in those rural locations, but absolutely at this stage is certainly not, necessarily transforming the overall picture from a market perspective. Moving then quickly onto the fixed side, we've talked a lot about mobile, a lot about wireless. I want to kind of come back to the fixed side and some really interesting research here around looking at the identification of fiber and the impact of Wi-Fi CPE on end user outcomes, and some of the modeling work that we've done in some markets. I really like to say at the moment in Europe and in other advanced markets, we are in a phase of shifting from focusing on the last mile to the actual last meter in the home. So fiber connectivity now really in many advanced European markets is homogeneous in nature. There's a lot of fiber overbuild in places like Spain and others, UK with the alt nets there. And the question then becomes, how do ISPs differentiate what is effectively a homogeneous pipe, providing, multi-gigabit speeds with XGS-PON. And you can see here in this particular graph looking at median fixed speeds, very high levels of speeds for the average user across these top markets in Europe. France, after breaching 300 megabits per second now on the fixed side, which is absolutely excellent. If you were to go back a few years, hard to believe how far we've come. But the interesting, I suppose, point I want to draw your attention to is that one of the countries here, Spain, that has the highest level of fiber penetration up there with the likes of Romania, doesn't necessarily actually excel in terms of speed. Now, it's not bad, but the level of fiber coverage would imply that their speed would be better, okay, and that their overall QoE outcomes will be better than they are in the data. And what is the reason for this? And the simple answer is that the Spanish have been great about getting to the doorstep, but they've forgot about the last meters in the home itself. If you look at this particular graphic here, this is looking at the usage of Wi-Fi technologies in the existing fixed base across Europe, and looking at those modern technologies and how much of Speedtest samples they account for. And you can see in the example of Spain here, it is well below the EU average in terms of the proportion of Speedtest samples in the second quarter that were based on these modern technologies. Whereas places like Switzerland, and in particular France, which has very high level of Wi-Fi 6 use, in particular those countries, they're quite far ahead in deployment of these modern Wi-Fi standards and CPE. So you have a scenario whereby Spain, is artificially limited and stunted on the fixed side by legacy CPE in the Wi-Fi base. And this is something that's been overlooked from a policy perspective. But again, something that we expect a lot more interest to come from over the next number of months. And practically, what does the impact of new CPE have on the end user experience? Well, this is an example from Italy. At the 10th percentile level, a step change in performance across Wi-Fi standard, the Wi-Fi standard base. So, over 300% speed improvement from Wi-Fi 6 to Wi-Fi 7. Now, many people will say, well, is this a fair comparison? Because many people on Wi-Fi 7 CPE might be on higher speed tariffs, or may have fiber, and Wi-Fi 6 people may have, more disproportionately like to have copper or cable or whatever. And I suppose my response to that would be, even when you control for the access technology and the provision speed, these gains hold, okay? And the same is true on the 90th percentile side. But I do want to draw your attention to the point that in this example from Switzerland, there are a significant number of ISPs and manufacturers that have not provided Wi-Fi 7 CPE that are tri-band in nature. They've done dual band. I suppose it could be described as cheaping out on the equipment. And you can see then that the performance improvement from 6E in some cases then is not significant, where there is quite a bit of use of dual band Wi-Fi 7 APs. So it's a message as well to ISPs around the importance of investing properly in CPE that are of high quality and that take advantage of the different attributes of Wi-Fi 7 around tri-band support, because not all Wi-Fi 7 capable CPEs are tri-band in nature, and we can see that having a big impact in the real world. Moving on then, just showing some of our research around how do we actually identify whether or not someone is on a high-speed connection or low-speed connection. What you're looking at here is from Italy and the distribution of speed test samples in the fourth quarter of last year. And you can see in our data very clearly, we can identify, the tariff profile that users are likely to be subscribed to. So you can see these kind of clustering of samples at the different speed levels, typically just below different intervals, like 1,000 megabits per second being suggestive of someone being on a gigabit provision profile, which is really interesting stuff. And if you look at it here from, this is an example that we did with Telecom Italia, what you're seeing here is that we see speeds clustering just below the 1,000 megabits per second mark on the downlink side. And this obviously is corresponding with their tariff package of speeds up to 1 gigabits per second. And in those markets where there is more Wi-Fi 7, Wi-Fi 6, the gap between the tariff advertised speed and the actual end user speed is smaller as well. And we've looked at that through comparing, Wi-Fi speed versus Ethernet and the gap and how that varies. So this is just some of the background context on our research and how we actually going about doing it that I thought might be interesting. And even more interesting, and this is really cool work that is emerging now, we are looking at the impact of fiber and other factors like the location of hyperscaler infrastructure, peering and CDNs on end user experience. So on the right side here, you can see this is the comparison of median web page load time. So the average web page load time on fiber connections versus non-fiber. And you can see, as to be expected, faster web page load times on fiber. You can see through these two different plotting mechanisms here. On the left, we have a map from the community level in Italy, looking at median web page load time. I want to draw your attention to the fact that in the south, there's a cluster of quite poor communities in terms of median web page load time. Now, when we look at speed and median download speed, the south actually might be surprising, but actually edges out the north in terms of speed, because of the fact that they have pulled down a lot of EU funding for fiber rollout there. So the fiber rollout has been quite progressive. So what's actually happening here is that even though there's potentially more fiber in parts of the south and better headline speeds, the end user quality of experience is actually still poorer, because so much of the traffic needs to be routed up to the north to be broken out, or up to Rome, for example. And in the Northern Industrial Triangle, where you have big hyperscaler presence, many CDNs, where most of the breakout interconnect is taking place, the outcomes are better. So this is a really tangible example of the importance of actually localization of infrastructure, where traffic is broken out on end user outcomes in terms of web page load time here. And I would like to give the example as well of in our data, we see countries like Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries that do quite well in terms of download speeds and upload speeds and all of that. But if we look at latency to cloud infrastructure, or latency to game servers, or latency to web page servers, which are important for the whole quality of experience, they do poorer than many European countries because they don't have the same hyperscaler presence. And this is a really important point around looking at the network performance end to end, not just the last mile or not just the RAM on the mobile side, but actually the importance of the core, of the peering, of the interconnect. And all of this is becoming more important now as networks need to be optimized for lower latency with, emerging AI use cases, which I'll speak about in a moment. But this is part of, I think, a sea change in the industry. Moving then very quickly then to a very different topic around network resilience and network vulnerabilities. This is a space we've done a huge amount of research on this year. There's been huge interest from operators and governments and regulators around how crowdsourced data, I suppose, can be used to proactively monitor network uptime and impacts and recovery. And, you know, telecoms operators themselves are in control of only part of their own destiny. They are reliant on the power grid for continuation of services where there is not power autonomy deployed at the site level or at the core network level. These are things that need to be designed for redundancy, resilience, all of that. And I like to give the analogy that modern day networks are kind of like, and the approach to modern day networks is kind of like flattening the curve during the pandemic, whereby, you know, those operators that have deployed a lot of power backup tend to have, you know, much lower impact. So the impact is suppressed and delayed or pushed out. So it's like vaccines or masks, I suppose, during the pandemic, the equivalent. This is our research from Spain during the blackout, which we shared earlier this year. And you can see that the profile of no service actually moved in lockstep with that of the power grid. So within 3 or 4 hours, the blackout happened at midday. You know, huge swathes of people were left with no service. So over 50% of the user base were left with no service. And the most startling graph potentially of the year, I think, for me, on the resilience side, is that we looked at the impact on the Portuguese operators in terms of the proportion of their users in our data that were left with no service. And you can see a substantial difference here. MEO had significant battery backup in their grid, large batteries widely deployed and generators, and therefore, you know, less than 20% of their subscribers were left with no service at peak. Whereas in this case, Digi, over 90% of their subscribers were left with no service for an extended period. The first kind of outage was stimulated by the fact that there was very little battery backup in what was a very young mobile grid. They're a new operator there. But then also the core network went down because they didn't have sufficient battery backup in their core or geo redundancy beyond Lisbon in the core. So this was a complete disaster. And it translated into substantial impact on the ability of people to call, text, and use mobile services. Just some examples of the impact we're seeing in other parts of the world. At the moment, we're tracking the recovery from Hurricane Melissa in Jamaica and other areas in that part of the world where we saw significant impact. Similar as well, this is the operator level comparison there. Big uptick in latency, for example, as backhaul connections and all were disrupted. And as well, significant storm activity in the Philippines. And you can see the impact it has had here on latency to cloud infrastructure, for example, where we're measuring the end-to-end latency across the network to cloud infrastructure. And, you know, the important point is that beyond the telco space, you know, outages in the service layer have been particularly damaging, I would posit, in the last number of months. We had the big AWS outage earlier this month or last month, and then we had the Cloudflare one earlier this week, which ironically actually impacted us and Down Detector itself, which just shows you the scale and the dependencies and the single points of failure that exist in the internet ecosystem, and the importance of actually designing with resilience and redundancy in mind at an early point. I'm moving very quickly now to the last part of these few slides because I wanted to get some questions in and any you know, feedback and make this kind of interactive. But we have started to do some research on the impact of cell density and distance to cell site and technology of use on end user battery life. This is looking at all devices in circulation that report battery life status and charge status. And what you can see here is that the battery life discharge time actually varies quite a bit by operator. This is from Czechia or Czech Republic. And that can be due to differences in spectrum use or network configuration and what they've done in the RAN. But you can see, you know, the impact of 5G on battery life here is substantial. You know, if you look at, for example, O2, a discharge time of over 13 hours on 5G and on LTE over 18 hours. So that is the real world impact of, you know, the 5G usage on the device level in terms of battery life on average. And geographically, it can vary as well in line with differences in the composition of the network. So how often is massive MIMO being used, low band versus high band, for example, which is really interesting. And we can see, you know, very clearly that in locations with poor cellular service, i.e. further away from the cell site, battery discharge time is far more rapid. This is empirical data here quantifying that. So you can see a discharge time of around, on average, around, you know, between 19 and 20 hours within 1 kilometer of cell sites on average in Czech Republic in this period. And that, you know, collapsed to around just over 14 hours. So much more rapid battery drain in those poor signal scenarios. This again is, I suppose, an interesting example of how and a role for operators as well to think about how they can optimize their network for better end user experience, not just speeds or performance, but also something as simple as end user battery life and how it can vary across technologies and across operators. And, you know, clearly as well, battery size is not a, you know, a perfect predictor of discharge time. There are devices that have larger batteries that maybe have older silicon, for example, that can stimulate quicker discharge. And very finally, before I go to the questions, I'm conscious now I'm a little bit over time here, but just wanted to talk about really quickly the impact of AI on traffic patterns and potential network requirements in the future and moving forward. This is an emerging research area for us that we are looking at very proactively. And really, in some, many vendors have put out quite, I would say, over the top forecasts around the impact of AI, potential impact of AI on traffic patterns. And in actual fact, what we see is that the moderation and growth profile is likely to continue in developed markets, and that much of the traffic burden is not on the RAN or the last mile, but is actually in the east-west layer, the data center layer between agents. And in fact, you may have a scenario whereby AI is driving down traffic growth as a result of some of the traffic burden shifting to the east-west layer, and as well because of the fact that you know, improvements in compression and new algorithms around that. And moving forward, it will be more and more important for operators to optimize their network infrastructure through the lens of routing and peering and cloud proximity. You can see here, this is an example of cloud infrastructure latency that we've measured in Slovenia. And you can see that those areas of the country that are further away from where much of the hyperscaler or CDN infrastructure is tend to have poorer latency to hyperscalers like Azure or AWS or others, because the traffic has to traverse longer distances. And that may not be such an impactful observation today, but you can already see in applications like GPT when you're in device or video mode, which I myself use quite regularly, the difference in experience on a low latency connection versus a high latency one in terms of how natural the feedback actually is. So this is, I suppose, just an interesting example of that. And then, you know, finally, then I suppose the other point to make here is that today we're very much in the chatbot era still. You send a prompt, you wait a few minutes to get it back. Latency is not so important or not so sensitive. But we are moving towards, you know, agentic workloads where there are maybe tens or dozens or, you know, hundreds of different micro calls in an agent workload where agents are communicating between one another in the east-west layer. And therefore, the utilization of the network is never really below 50%. It's always at a high baseline compared to the chatbot model where it'll be spiky. And when you have that kind of a scenario, what you have happening is a real focus and importance on latency, and in particular on the worst latency outcomes. Because if you have an agentic workload that's doing, you know, dozens and dozens of different tool calls and micro tasks, the importance of that P95 latency or the worst latency outcomes becomes greater, because the whole system is held up waiting for one call to come back, for example. So this is just showing here that latency, certainly in the east-west layer, and in the data center layer is becoming more and more important in the, I suppose, agentic workload era that is coming. And we are starting to see some telcos talking around, you know, agentic interconnect and working more closely with hyperscalers to ensure that there are lower latency to services like, you know, codecs, for example, with GPT. But yeah, so this is just an interesting example of latency becoming more important moving forward in the AI space. But I just wanted to wrap up there, and I conscious the last few slides I went through quickly, but just wanted to provide an opportunity for any questions. I hope I didn't rush through anything, and I know this is recorded, so if there is any questions that do come up retrospectively, please do reach out to me. This is a QR code. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, or I'm sure we can get my email. I just wanted to thank Anas and Anand for having me here in particular, and maybe we can look at see if there's some, I know there's some questions, Anand, that you had put into the chat here, and if there's anyone else, please do put in some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Look, interesting presentation with many insights that bring reality into the stage. Really appreciate it. We have 2 questions on the chat, but before taking them, if anyone from the audience wants to unmute and ask the question, please go ahead and do that. If no, then let us take the first question that was posted on the registration form, and it's about the development of 5G SA. And the question is the development of 5G SA being slowed down by the fact that users are likely to be getting slower speeds with SA comparable to non-SA in most circumstances due to the loss of multiple LTE and non-DSS dynamic spectrum sharing, I believe, carriers? So I think, yeah.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Anas. I wouldn't say it's being slowed down by that particular fact, but I think it is, you know, coloring the choices of operators in terms of needing to have a certain level of 5G SA capable devices and users ready to go before shifting spectrum to a network that would have very low utilization. So in some respects, potentially, but I think, no, more generally, I don't think it is necessarily a barrier factor. And that, you know, the bigger barrier factor for SA, for many operators, I would say, is still that, you know, reluctance to move to a platform that they would see at this point in time a limited monetization potential or high cost. Or, you know, I've spoken to many operators, and a big challenge actually in moving to the core is skills gaps, for example. That's becoming a bigger one, is that the skills gap within telcos to move to that software-based core is significant and increasing over time. So I think there are other factors here that maybe are more important than this one, but it's a good question, and it's a cautionary note around needing to make enough spectrum available on SA and to enable better performance than what was there with NSA, or at least comparable performance.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Luke. And we have another question also from the registration form, is that operators would have let me see here. The question is, notwithstanding that operators would have battery pack at all these sites, as in Ireland and in the UK, did Ookla Analytics see any differentiation between main power failures and site failures? Could it attribute to site outages, MTTO, I think here mean time to operate, and associate this with sites without backup? It must be noteworthy that batteries in hot climate do not have long uptime, especially base stations. I think here the question is maybe also about Spain and Portugal being slightly in hotter weather, or in areas where the weather is hotter than other locations in Europe.
Okay, no, thank you, and a very interesting question. First of all, I would actually there's a note in that question that says there's battery backup at all sites in Ireland and the UK, and I would push back against that actually, and mention actually there's certainly not, and there are a huge number of sites in the UK and Ireland that have no power autonomy whatsoever at the site level, and that's true across many European countries. In fact, Ofcom did modelling on the cost of bringing in multi-hour power autonomy at the site level, and it was, here projected to be very expensive to do so. And so there are obviously commercial challenges around expanding battery backup and power backup, whether it's battery or generator based, and generators being more suited obviously to multi-day outages. But you do, and you have seen operators like Elisa in Finland try and monetize that by resetting to the grid for grid stability, for example. And one of the points actually that I should mention around even some of the operators that had batteries in the Spanish and Portuguese outage, some of those batteries were already in a depleted state when the blackout took place, because they were being used to reduce the energy cost during the day. So they're charging at off-peak times. And then during peak times, they're discharging to reduce the energy cost. But then when the blackout happened midday, there was already some gone. So it's not the case that the batteries were sitting there waiting for a blackout as well, which is an important point to mention on that.
I think that's a very good observation, Luke, because many operators are looking to utilize the batteries more to reduce cost, and that has a negative impact. We see also some more questions. Please, Alex, I think, has a question.
Super. Thank you very much for the questions. Alex has a question. How do you see the ability of mobile networks to support mission critical services? So really good question, and a hot question at the moment. And I make the point, there's so much talk around, slicing for mission critical services, right? I would say slicing is only as capable and as resilient, a slice is only as resilient as the power autonomy is within the network. If you have a slice, a national slice for first responders, and there's no power autonomy in the network or power redundancy, the slice is basically useless if the power goes off. And Derek, apologies, you have your hand raised. Please feel free to interrupt.
Yeah, can you hear me, Luke?
I can indeed. Yeah.
I just want to ask you a question. Sorry, I'm in a crowded area here.
No problem at all.
I actually work from the actual telecom sector, right? And I know for a fact is that all our sites and all the sites which we work on do have battery backup. Right, that we will not turn on a site without a battery backup at all.
Okay.
And we never run a site during the day with batteries.
Okay.
Right. The only reason why I'm asking that is the fact is that I do know that during the summer we do have issues with batteries, because during the summer the batteries do actually run down because of the heat.
Okay.
And 75% of our alarms that actually come in are actually related to heat temperatures related to the batteries.
Okay.
And we spend most of our time opening doors, just releasing the actual temperature.
Okay.
So
interesting.
The only thing I'm trying to bring up is the fact is that the Iberian issue, I think, would run on the same thing we have. Is the fact is that the heat was there anyway. It was very warm, because it was very warm anyway. Because it was you're talking, it was 40 degrees or something like that.
Yes.
Most of the batteries would not have been able to cope with that temperature.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? So I think the phenomenon which actually happened in Iberia did actually bring an awful lot of the systems down quicker.
Okay.
Than if it was in, say, the power outage happened during the winter.
Yes.
You would have an awful lot of the base stations would have actually had at least 4 hours backup. You know what I mean? That's the only point I want to bring, is the fact is that in Ireland, now I'm not too sure about the UK, how they do it, but in Ireland, I know that Air, BT, Tree, Vodafone, they all have battery backup. They will not let a site go without batteries.
No, that's your point, and thank you very much for your.
No, you're fine.
But no, that's an excellent point, though, Derek, and it's one around the ambient temperature impact on the, I suppose, the redundancy profile of the site in a way. And I suppose the other point there would be the importance of cooling then at the site level. I'm sure. Because I know there was some interesting for the audience here. There was some work that was published in the last few weeks by the Irish government modelling climate impact on thermal stress on telecoms networks.
Yes,
and
this is the one that was just released. This is the one that was released recently.
Exactly, and really interesting insights there.
Yeah.
Exactly, but that's a really good point, Derek, and it's something maybe we should talk a little bit more about. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Now there is another issue as well. Is the fact is that the biggest use of power in every site is actually the aircon.
Yes, not surprised.
You know what I mean?
That's a double cost.
Of course,
yeah. Okay.
No, that's great. No, I just want to say that. That's all.
No, excellent. Thank you, Derek, for that. Appreciate that, and thank you for.
No worries. Thanks, Luke. Anyways, the presentation is brilliant.
Thanks, Derek. Thank you. Thanks, Derek. Some really interesting insights and notes there on the ambient temperature side. I see there's a question here around Bulgaria. How are things? I'm Bulgarian, and since you mentioned you recently visited Bulgaria, why do you think our operators have invested so much in N78? I think all our operators have 60 to 70% or more N78, which is large contrast. It's a really good question on Bulgaria. So number one, in the Bulgarian context, it's a very competitive market from a performance standpoint. That has stimulated a lot of investment in mid-band. And also, I suppose, Bulgaria is one of those markets like Greece that is more mobile-centric in that the fixed infrastructure quality is quite poor. Therefore, the mobile side is relatively more important and more, I suppose, competitive and invested in. And you're right. Very significant N78 deployment there. Maybe you can respond. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure myself around whether there was a particular instrument inserted in the coverage spectrum there to stipulate a minimum level of 3.5 gigahertz rollout or N78 rollout. I'm not sure. I'd have to check that note, but I'm sure there probably was. They may have also stimulated that high level of N78 coverage. But that's a really, really good point. And I believe, the Greece one, that was the SA is a significant Ericsson deployment, Ericsson RAN.
Hi, as far as I'm aware, there is no requirement for them to have a certain N78 coverage.
Okay.
There is a requirement to deploy a certain number of millimeter wave sites, which they have deployed. I think it was 15 in 2 years of getting the spectrum, then 50, then 250 in 8 years, which they seem to be deploying in some areas, but nobody can use it, of course. But there's no other coverage requirement.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thank you for that, Ivalo. Thank you. Interesting on the millimeter wave side, and that's something actually I should touch on around. We're starting to see a little bit of momentum again ticking up on the regulatory side. So the UK has just released millimeter wave spectrum, but as you mentioned there, and an important point, the device support does not exist yet in Europe, and therefore usage is non-existent really of millimeter wave. But that's one to look into more, is Bulgaria and why the N78 has been so widely deployed there. Thanks for that contribution, Ivalo. Good question. See if there's any other questions here.
Thanks. Simon has one last question. Any data you can share or link reliability for users in motion?
For users in motion. Okay, interesting. I'm trying to think now precisely if Simon is still in the meeting, what he...
Yes, so, hi everyone.
Hi Simon, how are things? Thanks for your question.
Yeah, no, really, absolutely fascinating presentation. I'm just wondering about, you've got data for, things like, is the link stable? Is the latency variable for people on trains, people in buses, passengers in cars, that kind of thing?
Absolutely, we absolutely do, and I'm glad you mentioned the word train there, Simon, because we have published very recently. I'll just show you this very quickly. We've just published a piece of research looking at connectivity on rail. And this is particularly looking at Wi-Fi on rail, but we have also and are doing research now on cellular. So we can detect if a sample, basically the motion status of the sample from the different information that's provided to us. But if you look at rail, this is just looking at speeds, Wi-Fi speeds on rail networks. Sweden actually doing very well there, thanks to a significant low band rollout for the cellular backhaul on rail. Places like the UK much further down, UK, Spain. But yes, we do have data on in motion. And that really, it's a really interesting point you make, because we do see big differences in performance in motion depending on the spectrum that's used and the density of the grid, for instance. So yes, yeah, we do. And if you have any other questions on that, Simon, I'm happy to follow up with you on that. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I will follow up, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you. I don't know if there's any last questions there. I know there's still a few here.
I think you covered them all, Luke, if I'm not wrong.
Perfect. Perfect. Super. Super.
Extremely interesting presentation and full of valuable insights. Thank you very much, Luke, for this presentation. Thank you also for everyone who participated in this presentation. And I'm sure, Luke, you will get many follow-up questions, including from myself at some time later, because you made me wonder about something, especially for the battery life and how the distribution of the sizes. I think we need to find in the industry even other metrics to measure the battery life. What we have already might be a bit misleading.
100%, 100%. No, thank you. And I just want to thank Anna and Anand for the great facilitation and setting this up. Really appreciate it. And for everyone for listening.
Thank you indeed, Luke. And I hope we meet you one day even face to face. If you come
Definitely
to Sweden, Stockholm, please let me know. Or if you come to Göteborg, let Anand know. We'll be also, again, we are very thankful also for this presentation.
Thank you. I look forward to coming to Stockholm at some point. Thank you.
Thanks again. Thanks, everyone.